Before I hand over to my esteemed co-panelists, we have Mr. Isop Pahad to my far, that's still my right, Mr. John Daniel to my immediate right, and Professor Patrick Bond to my immediate left. I suppose that the various words, I have not been here unfortunately, but I'm told and reliably informed that words such as revolution and uprising and revolt and resistance seem to have emerged, and some of the contestations around these and the contradictions. I was interested as well to hear about the Africa-Arab relationship and how, in fact, this begins to either galvanize or not the cohesion between the two. And of course, the notion of how moments are not really swift. The Arab Spring, as it were, is not a moment in time, it's a continuum, perhaps. And I think that it's also, as we go into this session on South Africa, would be interesting to note the iterations of how South Africa happened. It didn't happen on the April the 27th in 1994, but clearly a 350-year continuum of history and many moments. I'll say more later, but in the interest of time, I'd like to hand over to Isop Pahad to share with us challenges of transforming from liberation movement to government. You're very welcome.
Well, first of all, thanks to AMAC and to everybody working for AMAC for the invitation to come to this conference. At some point in what I'm going to say today, I'll refer back to some of the points raised by Garth Lapierre and Shireen Hassim yesterday, and a point made by Stephen Friedman. But the first thing I would say is that to better appreciate and understand the challenges confronting the ANC as a ruling party and how it sought and still seeks to meet these immense challenges, it is important that ANC conference and policy documents be closely studied, analyzed, and critiqued. Documents such as the strategy and tactics, through the eye of the needle, which actually is designed to act as a guide to ANC branches in determining who should lead the organization at branch, regional, provincial, and national levels. Policy discussion documents, even the recent ones on organizational renewal, economics, political, cultural, and international, the media, culture, social issues. But I think it's also very important to look at, certainly since 1990, very importantly, the Presidential and Secretary General reports to its national conferences, which is held every 5 years. You will find there very honest, robust, and sometimes very brutal criticism of the developments inside that organization. The second point I would make is that if you want to understand this country and you want to understand what it meant to be a ruling party here, we should never forget that apartheid had been characterized by the United Nations as a crime against humanity. In its time, it was the most racist, most sexist society in the world. And that's the condition and circumstances in which, in '94, following the elections, the ANC had to assume power. Now, we've been saying a lot about transformation, and I think we should try to have an understanding of what we mean by transformation. What I understand by transformation is that it has to be a fundamental, radical change that is progressive and in the interest of the urban and rural working people, the poor, the marginalized, and in its international postures, positions, and policies. It has to be in support of peace, security, and solidarity with people struggling in other parts of the world and in particular, I think right now, in solidarity with the Palestinians. Secondly, I would argue, and if you read the ANC documents, you will see that the ANC always speaks about attaining the objectives of a national democratic revolution. At some point, in my view, in terms of the quantitative changes that are occurring, there will have to be a qualitative leap to come to a situation in which you can say that you are nearing the objectives of a national democratic revolution. Now, yesterday in his paper, Garth Lapierre, very interesting paper, correctly spoke about the impediments to democracy. However, it seemed to me that he omitted to raise some very critical issues relating to the direct and indirect involvement, interference, and even diktat of the imperialist and neo-colonialist powers. Monopoly capital, both domestic and international, institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, and even as we've seen in the recent period, the role of rating agencies. Secondly, I think we need to factor in that since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, these major powers, imperial neo-colonial powers, United States, France, Britain, were greatly emboldened to pursue with aggression and violence regime change. And yesterday, Phyllis Bennis, for example, spoke about how, in her view, and I think very correctly, that the United States of America still remains a very, very powerful military and strategic power. So all of these different international institutions and instruments seek to impose neoliberal policies, demand that countries liberalize their economies so that they open up their markets for goods and products and services from the more developed countries, but find ways and means to prevent goods and services from the developing countries to enter their countries. And for me, that's a serious impediment to democracy, certainly in South Africa, certainly in other places, and it will definitely be an impediment to democracy in the Middle East countries that we discussed, or North African countries that we discussed yesterday. And we need to pay attention to this whole question of regime change. Nowadays, even the US Secretary of State is not afraid to come out openly and demand regime change, whether it was in Iraq, whether it was in the Ivory Coast, whether it's in Libya, and now in Syria. And in my view, if we are not careful, they will use, once there is broad acceptance of regime change, they will not be afraid to use it against progressive and revolutionary governments that seek to fundamentally alter socio-economic conditions in their own countries. Now, obviously, if we take a historical background, we know from Guyana in the 50s, Allende's Chile, Nicaragua, Grenada, that we've had direct imperialist interventions. We saw what happened in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia. And so I think a critically important impediment to democracy, which must also include the right for people to be able to develop their own policies and programs, comes from this external intervention. Monopoly capital, both domestic and certainly in the South African case, International do have a wide range of instruments that they can use. There's a migration of legal and illegal capital. There's the threat and the actual withdrawal of capital, withdrawal of investments, loans under very onerous conditions, leading to increased unemployment, conflict, and even creating the conditions for conflict to be wider in a given society. And so therefore, to me, one of the major impediments that we need to look at, and it didn't really come out for me in all the discussions yesterday, and some extent today, is to what extent will these major imperial neocolonial powers remain an impediment to serious democratization that must take place in North Africa. Then yesterday, Shireen Hassim, as a respondent, I think quite rightly, pointed out that what was partly missing was a critically important question in the process of democratization of the empowerment and emancipation of women. And you cannot seriously talk about transforming a society without the emancipation and the empowerment of women. To that extent, I would argue that in South Africa, post-94, there were some very serious efforts made and some successes scored in terms of the empowerment of women. Now, obviously, Shireen was also right when she argued that improvements in the representation of women in elected institutions are important, but not an end in itself. They're important because they should act as the basis for further change. And in South Africa, if you look at the actual figures, you will find that post-94, the government has made, and the ANC has made, great strides in terms of increasing women's representation. The ANC has a 50-50 policy. It doesn't always work out 50-50 in the local government elections. It doesn't always work out 50-50 in regional and provincial elections or branch elections, but it is an objective for which you can fight for. But the private sector lags very seriously behind in terms of the empowerment of women. So if you look at the boards of directors in the private sector, you will find that essentially there might be one woman or two women, and they are used by and large, I think, as a front to try to show that they are in favor of the empowerment of women. So I cannot understand how one can be now, you see this chairperson says 5 minutes and I haven't even started. She doesn't know me, so she hasn't been in Parliament. If she was in Parliament, she would have known. No, let me take but let me say what then are the problems that we face in the ANC now. So I don't have time to talk to you about the successes. I think one of the great difficulties that the ANC is going through at the moment is that factionalism is coming to become more and more an important factor in the life of this organization. That nepotism, cronyism, elements of corruption are also beginning to eat into the body politic, both of government as well as the ANC. But I would argue that the corrupter is the one who should receive the sternest punishments and not necessarily the corrupted. I think we also need to understand that in a context of very high levels of unemployment, especially of young people, if you go to our rural areas, you will find that the possibilities of finding a job are practically nil. So to be a counselor isn't necessarily just to serve. And our counselors, due to Sydney Mufamadi there, are relatively well paid, even our part-time counselors. And so to become a counselor means that you earn an income. And that income will keep the whole extended family. And so the demand to become a counselor in the ANC becomes so great that the internal dissensions and conflict in the women movements grow. Because if you are a branch chairperson and you want to be a counselor, you've got to get rid of a sitting councillor. Now, how do you get rid of a sitting councillor? You can organize, by the way, protests, you can organize demonstrations. Incidentally, in my view, quite a lot of demonstrations and protests and that are organized by ANC members who want to replace sitting councillors. And I think that's one of the difficulties that the ANC faces as a ruling party. I think there's a very serious lack of political education. It's not, I don't think it's the present administration to blame. I think all of us who were in the leadership of the movement prior to, after 94 also did not do the kind of political education work that you brought up your cadres in a way in which they were ready to serve the people. For me, one of the worrying things that has happened in this movement, and it started really just after 94, and I think it's gone worse now, is that you find there is a growing anti-theory, anti-ideology attitude growing in the movement. I still find it absolutely shocking that leading people who say they are Marxists or communists are very proud to be called a pragmatist. Now, for me as a Marxist, the philosophy of pragmatism is just about the most reactionary philosophy there is. What's good for me today is good, what's good for me tomorrow is good, what's good for me the next day is good. So there is no consistency in either your theory or your ideology. And therefore, what is the perspective, what is the vision that you would put across to the membership that you bring into the movement? And so quite clearly, I think one of the critical questions that the ANC and its alliance partners face today is the question of the quality of leadership. If the quality of leadership at the top is not rich, the quality of leadership lower down the structures is going to be even poorer. Lastly, let me make a propaganda exercise. Let me say this, for all these North African countries and that have said they've made changes, I hope that one of the tools of measuring whether Egypt, Libya, Syria are going to become democracies is to what extent are those countries ready to come out in support of the Palestinians. Are they ready to confront the United States of America and the others? Because if they don't, then you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar now are supposed to be the embodiment of democracy. Well, really. It's incompatible to be a feudal regime and to be a democrat. But at least, instead of just throwing money at the Palestinians, they can take political positions that would strengthen the capacity and the hands of the Palestinians to carry out the revolution. So I would say in the end, that at the end of this conference, a measuring yardstick to determine whether these countries are democratic or not is the extent to which they're going to come out in support of the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I must say that for a political scientist not well versed in the politics of North Africa and Middle East. These last 2 days have been a fantastic learning curve, a very rich experience for me, and I am grateful to AMEC for making it possible for me to be here. I'm going to share some thoughts on the South African transition in the hope that they might be of benefit to colleagues from the region who are themselves grappling with the problems of transition. I'm going to talk quite a lot about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of which I was fortunate to be a part, but I want to make it clear at the outset that the Truth Commission as an event embraced only 5 years of this so far 18-year transition. It was a powerful and important moment in the transition, but it was not a be-all and end-all of itself. It has formed part of a much larger national reconciliation project of the post-apartheid era. I mentioned yesterday in response to Shireen Hassim that when she described moments of transition as ones of uncertainty and of possibility, and I added that they can also be very violent moments, and I drew attention to the violence that accompanied the negotiations in South Africa, and I should also draw attention to the fact that the violence of the 1980s involved far more than just South Africa, but it embraced the entire Southern African regime with countless tens of thousands of casualties. In fact, the South African apartheid destabilization of the region was really one of the great crimes of the 20th century. So in 1994, the government of the day faced an enormous challenge, a challenge not just of bringing peace to the region and to South Africa, the challenge of dealing with the hideous legacy of 350 years of oppression, the challenge of racism. It also faced the challenge of actually keeping South Africa together as a single entity. And in 1994, many of us have forgotten that that unity was not necessarily guaranteed, that there were powerful forces on the side of Inkatha, in KwaZulu-Natal, on the side of the white right wing with their deep roots in the military and security, who were threatening to try and take themselves or parts of the country out of the region. And this is why compromises and concessions were necessary. But there was another challenge which we often don't recognize, and that was the challenge of building a sense of common South African patriotism, an identity as one South African nation. We were not one nation in 1994. We could not be. We as a people under apartheid could not know each other. We existed under divide and rule. Whites could not know black people. Whites could not share schooling, could not share residence, could not share virtually anything with their compatriots across the color line. So an enormous part of this project of national reconciliation has been to create a common identity as a South African, a common love for this country, a common sense of patriotism. And I think the governments of the post-apartheid period need to be complimented for certain successes in this area, that there is now a much greater identity. Black spectators do no longer cheer for the other side at rugby matches. South Africans, I think, across the board, welcomed and rejoiced when a young white man won a swimming medal at the recent Olympics, and a white rower, a black rower, won a gold medal. Now, before Patrick jumps down my liberal throat, of course, I must acknowledge that there's a certain class dimension to this embrace of common South African patriotism, and those of us who have been beneficiaries of the post-apartheid era probably have a very different outlook on the issues of national identity and patriotism than, say, for example, the miners of Marikana. But the Truth Commission has been part of this enormous challenge of national reconciliation. And the Truth Commission itself has its origins in a debate. In the late 1980s, I became aware of that debate in exile in London as part of the ANC, when the issue arose as information became aware of secret negotiations and the possibility of the transition. The question arose, how are we going to deal with our immediate past? And I'm sure this is a question that is entertaining the minds of the leaders of North African countries. How are we going to deal with the fact that post the transition we will have in our midst the political leaders of the National Party who are responsible for this crime against humanity that Aesop described, that we will have in our midst the generals from the military and the officers of the police responsible for the deaths of countless thousands of South Africans and Southern Africans, for the forcible removal and displacement of millions of people. What are we going to do? How are we going to hold these individuals, that system, accountable? And at the time, it looked to us, to Kader Asmal, to Larbi Sadiki, who were leading this debate, that there were only two options. One, the Nuremberg option, political trials. The other was simply to do what most nations do, and that is do nothing. To simply wipe the slate of the past clean, to develop a discourse around, well, we need to build a new future, we can't be dragged back into the past. Now, this was a position that was not acceptable to the ANC in 1990, and I think I am correct in saying that the ANC went into the negotiations process committed to the Nuremberg option, committed to trials. But of course, as the negotiations proceeded, as 1 year turned into 2, 3, and 4, that option no longer became a viable option. It was no longer seen as an option. It was not seen as possible to spend 4 years negotiating with the other side, have an election, win the election, and then immediately start arresting those who had negotiated with you. That was not viable. And so, not politically possible. And of course, this is one of the lessons we have to learn when we examine and plot transitions, is that we need to be aware of what is politically possible at the time. It was not politically possible in 1994 in South Africa to arrest P.W. Botha, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and whoever else, and put them on trial. But of course, equally, there was a determination not to do nothing. And so the ANC began to look for a third way. And they discovered in their examinations of recent transitions in Africa and Latin America a number of instruments, which we now call instruments of transitional justice, that were available to facilitate a transition process and as instruments of accountability. There was, of course, the issue of amnesty. And amnesties are deeply controversial, deeply unpopular, particularly as they often do take the form of blanket amnesties, as they did, for example, in Chile. These are not viable instruments, a blanket amnesty, because it's a form of impunity. But I think one of the great contributions of the South African TRC process to international human rights practice is that they developed a system of earned amnesty, a conditional amnesty, that the possibility of amnesty for perpetrators was hung out there in return for a number of conditions, one of which was full disclosure. So in a sense, one could say one traded justice, retributive justice, for truth. But in fact, the South African amnesty process became the most powerful source of truth about the past. It was through the amnesty process that we were able to confirm what we suspected about the killings of Steve Biko and countless other activists. So amnesty is one instrument, if carefully crafted, can be a powerful instrument of truth. Then there are truth commissions themselves, which are simply commissions of inquiry. Reparations is another. Lustration, the stripping of civil and political rights from those who collaborated with the oppressive regime, denying them their civil and political rights, denying them the right to vote, to stand for office, perhaps for 5 years, as was the case in Mozambique, or for life, as has been the case in some Eastern European countries. That is another instrument of accountability, one we did not use. Apologies, monuments, memorials. Now, South Africa opted for a process which combined 3 of these instruments in one: amnesty, a truth commission inquiry, and reparations. It was a model that no one had ever tried before, and unfortunately no one has done so since. There have been other truth commissions since ours, but they have simply been inquiries. They have not wrapped up the package around, as we did, amnesty and reparation. And this, in addition, that this approach was also ideologically wrapped up in a notion and a concept of reconciliation and forgiveness. What Tutu and others did was take this idea, this concept of reconciliation, and turn it into what has become the grand narrative of post-apartheid. Now, I don't have time to go into restorative and retributive justice, but simply to say that the concept of reconciliation as applied in South Africa did not amount to a clean slate offering of forgiveness. It offered perpetrators the possibility of forgiveness in the context of truth and accountability. It offered the possibility of both giving a voice to victims to tell their stories, but an opportunity to perpetrators to come forward and unburden themselves and make a fresh start. And this notion of forgiveness and accountability and reconciliation has, I believe, been a very important and powerful part of the social glue that has held South Africa together since 1994. The TRC process itself was inaugurated through legislation. And I would urge those of you from other countries who are considering a Truth Commission approach, do it through an act of your legislature, through an act of parliament, because and give it powers, give it teeth, give it the power as we had to subpoena. Give it the power to search and seize, to go into military and police stations and take the documentation you need. Give it power, but also it gives it legitimacy. Because if it is created by a legislature that has emerged from a democratic process, it has legitimacy. And in its operations, make sure that it is public and it is open. One of the great strengths of the South African process was that it was visible. It was open. Every hearing was televised and then summarized for 84 weeks. Do we remember? Special assignment this week in the TRC, 84 weeks of what became the most watched program amongst black audiences in South Africa. Every hearing was recorded and broadcast live on radio. It became an enormous media event. It was a form of public education, and I think a very powerful form of education for whites, because it confronted whites who basically, most whites will have lived in denial. They did not know. They did not wish to know. But here it was confronted every day on the television, on the news, today in the TRC, and I believe it had a humbling and shaming effect, and that is powerful. So one of the lessons then is, if you're going to have a Truth Commission process, give it teeth and make sure it operates in the open, and also make sure that it is a dialectical process, as ours was. The first 15 months of the Truth Commission was basically a forum for the victims of the past. 21,000 South Africans came forward and told their stories. This is what happened to us. This is what happened to our family. Or, what happened to my son who went into exile and never returned? Find the truth. Find the bones of those who were extrajudicially executed, etc. And I make this because in the concept of restorative justice, that retributive justice is not the only form of justice. There is something called restorative justice. And justice is more than punishment. Justice is being heard. People who were never heard from before were able to come forward and in public tell their stories. I remember a famous occasion when in Durban at a hearing in 1996, when a woman is coming forward and telling them about the death at the hands of the security police of her child, and she was getting the dates mixed up. And Tutu was getting extremely irritated. Well, was it 86 or was it 87? And she suddenly turned around and said, "Archbishop, I never thought anybody would want to hear my story, so I didn't bother to remember the dates." It's one of the few times I ever saw him really shut up. So there is a justice in being heard. There is a justice in being acknowledged, for victims to have the injustice acknowledged, because we know that after centuries and decades of oppression, victims begin to think it's their fault. There's a justice in also knowing the truth. And let me also say that if you go into a process like this, there will be, hopefully you will reach certain, they will have consequences which are anticipated. You will derive truth. But also I would argue that in the case of the South African Truth Commission, there was a great unanticipated political consequence. And that is that the Truth Commission process contributed to the destruction of the National Party. The drip by drip allegations against the National Party that were confirmed by the perpetrators who came. Yes, we did kill those people. Yes, we did burn those bones. Yes, we did throw them in the river. Yes, we did extrajudicially execute them and bury them in secret. That stuff that was denied for years by the nationalists undermined the credibility, and it demobilized the power of the right. So my appeal to is have some kind of process. There is not one model that fits all. Tunisia and others must decide what model is politically possible and is best, but have some kind of process. Do not do nothing as Zimbabwe did, and look where it is today. Namibia has never dealt with the issue of the missing detainees. Bygones do not become bygones. They eventually return to haunt you, as anybody who has studied the history of post-Tito Balkans can testify. Thank you very much.
We've had a really interesting series of contestations, and whether it's between the past and the present, whether it's between the political and the economic, whether it's between men and women, whether it's between the personal and the public, I'd like to hear about, whether it is between truth and lies, whether it's between voices and silence. And perhaps Patrick can shed some more light. You're very welcome.
Thanks, it's a very great pleasure and honor. It's a bit loud, I apologize. Let's see if I can get the right balance. It's a great honor to be with the panelists and to be at this very fine conference. AMEC is just doing such a fantastic job to educate us in South Africa about the core character of the uprising and its continuation or counter-revolutions. And I'd like to just think of two different dynamics to begin the commentary. I think most of you know that last week Cairo accepted a $4.8 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. The prime purpose seems to be repayment of the interest due on $35 billion of Mubarak's debt. Now, a year ago, you probably remember, this deal with the IMF was rejected because of mass popular pressure. The Tahrir Square residue was so strong. And I think now this counter-revolutionary process is clearly in train. In contrast, in Tripoli, the Tunisian government has just announced last week the beginning of a debt audit, an audit of the inherited debt. Think back to 2008 in Carthage, where the head of the IMF received an award from Ben Ali. He said, quote, "Economic policy adopted here is a sound policy and is the best model for many emerging countries. Tunisia is making impressive progress in its reform agenda. Its prospects are favorable." I should have said that in a French accent. It's Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Disgraced, but the tradition continues. Christine Lagarde, his successor, said much the same in Nigeria and suggested doubling the fuel price by getting rid of subsidies. And that gave rise to Occupy Nigeria in January, and nearly the revolution that would have overthrown the Jonathan government had he not finally repelled that advice. But in Tripoli, in September 2010, the IMF pressured Ben Ali to, quote, this is their words, "reduce tax rates on businesses and offset those reductions by increasing the standard value added VAT rate," end quote. 27 December came along, an informal survivalist street trader who did not pay the 18% VAT rate, was subject to a police attack. His fruit cart was overturned. It caused frustrations. The man publicly self-immolated. Mohamed Bouazizi began this uprising in a systematic way, and we are incredibly grateful to all those who sacrificed so much to teach us that this isn't just about getting rid of a family, but it's getting rid of a system supported, just as Issa Pahad said, by the most, quote, serious impediment to democracy, the interference of imperialists, the diktat, monopoly capital, institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, financial rating agencies with a wide range of instruments, end quote. I think I got you word for word there, Comrade Pahad. So what were the 6 processes by which South Africa moved from racial to class apartheid 20 years ago that you should be aware of in North Africa and the Middle East? We had more than a dozen World Bank reconnaissance missions from 1990 to 1994 in all the sectoral areas. So basically every single terrain of social policy, public policy, was predetermined by the reconnaissance missions. And secondly, by their intermediary agencies, the allies like the Anglo-American corporations, Urban Foundation, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the sort of local comprador bourgeoisie someone mentioned this morning in public policy formulation. Thirdly was an October 1993 agreement by the African National Congress to repay the apartheid debt, $25 billion in foreign loans, and that prevented subsequent ANC government social spending. Fourth, the interim constitution in November 1993 assured property rights and, quote, independent central bank policy. The Reserve Bank, just down the road, that huge big black building, is independent. That means immune from any democratic impulses in the society. Fifth, the International Monetary Fund in December 1993 gave an $850 million loan that included all the standard Washington consensus menu items, public sector wage and spending cuts. And sixth, in January 1994, the International Monetary Fund's managing director, Michel Camdessou, explicitly told Nelson Mandela to reappoint the apartheid-era finance minister, Derek Keyes, and central bank governor, Chris Stall. So those were 6 of those processes where I think Comrade Pahad would, I hope, acknowledge we too were subject to imperialist diktat. And as a result, we've ended up very badly. I think I'd like to make the argument that this is an example of a country not to follow economically. Before I do that, you can't simply talk about that in the Truth Commission. I'd say to John Daniel, as Yasmin Suka told us yesterday, the Truth Commission nailed a few people who pulled the trigger, and that was done to get amnesty for the leaders. They didn't do time in jail. They were not held accountable. F.W. de Klerk can go on CNN and defend apartheid, as he did a few weeks ago. And most importantly, the main beneficiaries, the whites of South Africa, got off scot-free. They didn't pay. Corporations, there was 1 or 2 hearings, but they got off the hook for setting up the foundation of apartheid. What was that? Migrant labor and the Bantustan system. Oh, but surely that's gone now. But Marikana says that's not so. We did have other options. We could have tried to undo migrant labor as part of that. We could have had, as Saint-Pierre Terre Blanche, with a wonderful new book, Lost in Transformation, advocated a wealth tax. There were many of us arguing. Truth Commission ignored all that, John. I hope you would acknowledge that it was really lubricant for neoliberalism rather than friction. So when you mention reparations, John, I'd hope you'd acknowledge that Thabo Mbeki's regime came out on the reparations issue on behalf of multinational corporates who are being sued by the Jubilee and Kulamani groups in New York. One of the greatest shames that show the Mbeki regime's capacity to talk left so it can walk right. How deep, Issa Pahad, is this critique within the ruling party? Does it go into macroeconomics, or do we continue with the planning minister, Trevor Manuel, who set all of these neoliberal policies in train? I'd like to echo as well in Zimbabwe. We're on a completely disastrous path. We're calling for a total overhaul of the economy of South Africa. We've inherited an economy designed to serve the interests of a small minority. We've not developed an industrial strategy, end quote. And as a result, to all of you, you might see the glitter here in Pretoria and go through the OR Tambo airport and get on the cow train. But you will not have observed, I suspect, the long-term stagnation in the economy, much higher unemployment than before, much higher inequality, for the apartheid regime to leave us the second highest inequality in the world after Brazil, and for us to overtake that and become by far the worst major society in inequality was quite an extraordinary accomplishment. We've deindustrialized huge sectors of labor-intensive manufacturing, clothing, textiles, appliances, electronics, footwear. We've suffered massive capital flight as big business has taken the money abroad. 23% of GDP in 2007, the worst year, according to Wits University economists. The biggest companies were basically allowed to relist in London. So they took the apartheid loot and ran away. We've got pretty much the highest interest rates in the world. Last year, the Reserve Bank acknowledged that only Greece's interest rates in nominal terms are higher than ours amongst major trading partners. We've got a much higher domestic and foreign debt load. Our foreign debt, inherited 25 billion, is now over 110 billion. We're heading for a massive debt crisis. We have the worst speculative bubble in real estate in the world. The Economist magazine estimated from 97 to 2008, double number 2, where I was born in Ireland. And finally, as a result of all of these, a terrific current account deficit that in 2009, according to the Economist magazine, made South Africa the most risky of our peers in the emerging markets. And yet we're continually told, thank goodness for the African National Congress's macroeconomic stability. We've had 6 crashes of the currency, 6 of more than 15%. Only a little country just over the Limpopo River's done worse. So, as Dr. Pahad says, Comrade Pahad, we need fundamental, radical change that is progressive in the interests of the masses. It has to be in support of peace, security, and solidarity, foreign policy. And he ends up, and I'm completely with Comrade Pahad, especially with Palestine. And that's absolutely true that this government has done as much as any. But there's so much more. For example, Comrade Pahad, and maybe Comrade Casserols, if he's still here, could please try and explain why Veolia, one of the #1 targets of the BDS movement around the world, is being given massive support across South Africa to roll out water privatization systems. I'd also ask about others in solidarity we should be with. Zimbabweans, Swazis, Burmese Democrats. How did we do there? Why did we sell arms to the US and UK belligerents during the Iraq War? And why is it that my phone company, which I'm charged extortionate monopolistic prices for, so they can get profits and buy Durko's foreign policy? Why hasn't that been said so far? We could get into some of the other aspects that's been up here. Improvements for women. Yes, quotas for professional women and politicians, bravo. But life expectancy, thanks to HIV/AIDS, we haven't done well. It's gone down, especially for women. 350,000 people are the estimated deaths that the Harvard Public Health School has done in a study of Thabo Mbeki's HIV/AIDS policies. Last little dig at Comrade Pahad. This is on the question of protests. Are they coming because councillors are in the midst of ANC factionalism, starting service delivery protests, quote, trying to replace sitting councillors? Is it, as our predecessor here on the panel, Stephen Friedman, put it in many times, the incompetence, the corruption, the lack of voice at local level? Or can we finally start talking, especially with a former Minister of Local Government, Minister Mufmadi, in the room, about national policies that are inherited from the World Bank? The World Bank wrote many of our municipal policies, and the lack of money that's going to municipalities to pay the subsidies required to get the services to people. And I'll conclude by citing a man mentioned yesterday who passed away Monday morning, Neville Alexander. In his last major speech, which was at my university, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, an unfinished revolution, he put it like this in just a few sentences, because he's describing the fact that South Africa, along with China, and now I gather Algeria, has about the highest protest rate per person in the world. Quote, "The working and unemployed masses are voting with their feet. The thousands of township uprisings, countrywide strikes, and serial metropolitan protest actions have one simple meaning: we reject your policies and your practices as anti-worker and anti-poor. They are saying very clearly and very loudly that the appeal to nationalist blood and soil rhetoric has lost its power, and that we are standing on the threshold of a politics that will be shaped by a heightened sense of class struggle. It is this understanding that should inform our analysis and our estimation of the prospects for a more principled direction of the struggle in South Africa." End quote. I'll end by saying the Middle East and North African uprisings have been so inspiring. We hope we can inspire you with positive signs that protest results from a transition from racial to class apartheid. Thank you.